Today I'm going to go over all the materials you're going to need in order to start hand sewing and machine sewing. I already posted 2 shorter videos on this on my Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube Shorts, but I wanted a longer video where I am able to go more in depth on every single thing that you need to get and how to choose the right one if you are going to buy it. But I will say you do not need to go out and buy new materials. You can definitely work with what you have at home. Ask your family, your friends if they have any sewing materials, because I promise you, you will be surprised by how many people actually have these things laying around. Another resource that you can do for free is to check out your local libraries. A lot of libraries have maker spaces and you can literally just access them. All you need is a library card, I believe, and completely free. I'm pretty sure all the libraries' maker spaces also have a couple of people around to help you out with any machines if you have any questions. If your family and friends don't have anything to lend you and you are not near a library that has a maker space, the next budget-friendly option would be to go to places like flea markets, garage and estate sales, and Facebook Marketplace. Even Goodwill. I'm a huge believer in not over-consuming, so if you don't need to buy something new, don't buy it. You can find a full list of everything that I talk about here and more listed on the full sewing materials list that I have available in the link in my bio. At the beginning of the list is a self-assessment. It's just a checklist that you can go through and kind of gauge what level you are at. I broke down all of the sewing materials into 6 levels. Honestly, if you're a level 5 or 6, you probably don't need this list. So we're going to be starting off with the hand sewing materials that you need, and that's level 1 on the sewing materials list. So the first thing you're going to need are hand sewing needles. I recommend getting a full set just because if you only buy one-off, I don't even know if you can buy one-off hand sewing needles, but it's very easy to lose them and you don't want to be in the middle of a project, lose it, and then not have anything to replace it with. It's great to have an assortment because different needles serve different functions. So these smaller needles, and they're a little bit more fine, are going to be great for very delicate materials, and you're not going to really be able to use these on thicker fabrics, whereas the thicker needles are going to have the durability to go through layers of thick fabric. But if you were to use the thicker needles on the thinner fabrics, you're going to end up making these huge holes, and sometimes the holes are so big it just ruins the fabric. The next one is a thimble. I don't know why I put this in level 2. It's actually great to have when you're first starting off with hand sewing because you're going to need this to push your needle through multiple layers of fabric. So thimbles are just this little cap that goes on top of your finger. Because I have long nails, I will stuff paper towels into it to hold it steady, and then at the top of these thimbles here, you can see that there's like a grid pattern, and that's to give it some place to grip the needle as it's going through different layers of fabric. Some people can sew without a thimble. I'm truly just not one of those people, because when you're sewing with your hand, you are going to be going through multiple layers of fabric and it's going to get stuck and it's really hard to push through. And even just now, as I demonstrated it, this is really painful to push through forcefully. So that's why you need a thimble, to be able to protect your finger as you're pushing the needle through. The next thing you're going to need is thread. I have a black and white spool here, pretty big. I also have colors. If you're just starting out, you really don't need spools this big. I would recommend starting with something small, or even smaller than this if you're kind of just testing out sewing and not sure if this is something you want to stick with. I always recommend starting out with colors just because the contrast is really nice to see and you can immediately see the mistakes and where you're stitching. That was just me. If you prefer to immediately start with something that matches your fabric, do that. Besides the size and color of the thread that you're choosing, the next thing that you have to consider is the composition. So what material is the thread actually being made of? The fiber content to thread is typically either cotton or polyester. I would recommend starting off with 100% cotton thread just to start, because I'm going to be teaching with 100% cotton fabric, and 100% cotton thread is the best to match with 100% cotton fabric. And the reason why I'm choosing 100% cotton fabric to start off with is because it is the easiest to handle and most uniform uniform when you're just starting out. But if you're planning on sewing a lot of projects using polyester and polyester blends, then you should consider getting a polyester thread. Just be careful if you're using polyester thread for any cotton projects, because if you're using a really high heat to press out your project, you're running the risk of the thread melting, because polyester is in fact plastic, and if you expose it to really high heat, it can melt. That being said, people do choose polyester thread when working with polyester fabrics just because it is a little bit stronger and is more resistant to breaking than cotton. But again, if you have access to thread for free and you're not sure what it's made out of, totally fine, use that. The next thing you're going to need are a good pair of fabric scissors. These are Ginger scissors. Pretty inexpensive in the grand scheme of things, but a little bit of an investment if you were just starting. They've lasted me for quite some time. I'm not even sure if I've ever needed to get these sharpened, but if your scissors do get dull and you really enjoy your pair of scissors, I highly recommend you just going to get your scissors sharpened rather than buying a new pair of scissors. You need a special pair of scissors for fabric, and then you're also going to need another pair of scissors for paper. Fabric scissors cannot be mixed up with your paper scissors, and my paper scissors, I'm pretty sure, are just like an old pair of fabric scissors that I used to have that became dull, but I preferred using it on paper because it was pretty, I just liked it. I've also had my fair share of other paper scissors, but a lot of them got stolen when I was at school, so here we are with this pair that I've been able to keep. The reason why you need separate scissors is because your fabric scissors are really, really sharp, and whenever they're cutting anything that's not fabric, they actually get duller. Anytime that you're cutting paper without any fabric pin to it, you're going to want to be using your paper scissors so that you do not dull out your fabric scissors. And for those of you who are not familiar with the term pattern or pattern paper, they're just referring to the pieces of paper that have the shapes drawn out of whatever you're sewing. So for example, if I am sewing a simple shirt, there's going to be the front of the shirt, the back of the shirt, and the sleeves. And all of these are going to be different shapes that are drawn out on a flat piece of paper that I'm going to be able to cut out and then pin that shape of paper onto fabric and then cut that out and then sew all of the pieces together to make a shirt. So if you ever hear the term pattern paper and pattern pieces and patterns in general, that's what it's referring to. The next thing you're going to need are some pins. You can also use fabric clips. I personally don't use them because I just wasn't trained with them, but a lot of my friends use them and love them. Fabric clips are great because you don't lose them as easily, they're not as dangerous. Fabric clips are also great with working with other materials like leather, pleather, and suede, where whenever you puncture it with a pin, for example, or any needle, that hole is permanent. So you want to have something like clips that's not going to leave unnecessary holes and marks except for exactly where the stitches are being made. I personally like to have different types of pins just because I work with different fabric weights. So whenever I'm working with something that is a little bit lighter, I like to use silk pins. And the reason for using silk pins rather than these pins on lighter weight fabrics and more delicate fabrics is just like what I was saying earlier with puncturing your fabric with holes. When a fabric is really delicate and tightly woven, you want to be using the smallest pin possible, because when you're using thicker needles like this, it's going to leave lasting holes that don't really recover because you are puncturing and breaking threads, and it leaves holes that don't look great. The next thing you're going to need is measuring tape. You might be familiar with the measuring tapes that have a circle body that are retractable. I really don't like using them. I don't recommend them. They're convenient because everyone gives them out for free. But when it comes to actually using them for sewing, they're really inconvenient, kind of dangerous. I don't like using this at all because it's clunky, you have like a weight attached to it. I much rather prefer using a soft measuring tape that is not retractable and is free to use like this. Just a heads up that all of the tutorials that I'm going to be posting are going to be using the imperial system rather than the metric system. So I'm going to be saying things in measurements of inches rather than centimeters and millimeters. The next thing you're going to need is a seam ripper. And you guessed it, these are for ripping seams. This will literally be your best friend when you are just starting out. Anytime that you need to undo any type of stitches, this is what you are going to use. These are the seam rippers that I have. For the most part, seam rippers look pretty much the same. The only difference is when you have like a miniature seam ripper. I personally don't really enjoy using those, even though it can be a little bit more convenient at certain times. I always prefer a larger handle and a full-size seam ripper. The next thing you're going to need is fabric. Like I mentioned earlier, I'm going to be using 100% cotton muslin to start off with. Muslin is just the term for this type of material that is unfinished, it's not bleached. It's a pretty affordable material to get when you are first starting out, but if you are on a budget and you do not want to spend, you can also try to use your old pillowcases, your old bed sheets to start off with. The next tool I'm going to mention isn't necessarily an essential, but I personally need it in order to keep my mental sanity sometimes, and that is a needle threader. A needle threader is exactly what it sounds like. It helps you thread needles, and I have a tutorial on how to use this on TikTok and YouTube Shorts already. Basically, this wire, you stick it through the eye of the needle, which is the hole on the needle, and it provides you with a bigger hole to put the thread through rather than the eye of the needle. So it just helps you by making the hole bigger. Pull this through and you're able to thread the needle. The next thing you're going to need is a pencil and some erasers. Any pencil will do. The only reason I bring this pencil up is because it is truly my favorite pencil. I've used it so much that the ink has literally rubbed off because of my finger oils, which is gross, but it's been years. I've converted so many of my friends to start using this pencil. Once you use it, you'll kind of get why it's such a great pencil, but you know, everyone has their own preference. I like to have this eraser. It's white and it's called a high polymer eraser. There's just less dust that is formed with the eraser when you're erasing, and I like that it's white because the classic pink erasers that you typically see in classrooms, I've used that on fabric before and it's like almost kind of stained the fabric that I've worked on, so it's been super important since then that I use this specific eraser from Pentel. These Mono Zero erasers from Tombow are great. You don't really need them, especially if you're just starting out. I just list it here because I did start off with them and I love them because of how much precision they give me, especially when I'm working with patterns and adjusting. It's been great. The next thing you're going to need is a sewing machine. Mine is the Brother CS5055PRW. It was a collaboration with Project Runway, so it was sold in a set with different accessories that were made for garment making. If you're just starting out, you truly don't need a really fancy machine. I would say that the bare minimum is just that your machine can do a classic straight stitch and a zigzag stitch. My machine does come with 50 stitches, but you really don't need them when you're first getting started. The next thing you're going to need are machine sewing needles, and these are different than hand sewing needles. These are going to have a thicker shank at the top just because it needs to fit into your machine, and the eye of the needle, which is the hole that the thread goes through, is towards the bottom where the sharp part of the needle is, as opposed to on a hand sewing needle, it's actually on the other end of the sharp point. If you are trying to make really clean projects, you absolutely need an iron. Every time I start a sewing project, I iron the fabric. Even in between sewing stitches, I iron the fabric. It's crucial, and I feel like not enough people talk about how important it is to have a good iron. It doesn't even need to be fancy, it just needs to be good, and you need to be on it when you're sewing your projects to iron in between everything that you are sewing. I promise you it makes a huge difference. Most irons are going to be fine to use. The only thing that I would look out for is to make sure that it has an option to steam, and also that there are adjustable temperature settings because you are going to need to adjust the temperature based off of what material of fabric you're going to be ironing out. I also have an ironing board, but if you don't have space for an ironing board, at least just get an iron. The next thing you're going to need are marking tools, and marking tools are for exactly that. You're just marking the fabric so that you know where to sew. This is the classic piece of chalk. It's a singular consolidated form of chalk. It's great to have because it has really high contrast, so whenever you draw it on a fabric, it's really easy to see. I do recommend having different colors of chalk just because depending on what color the fabric you're working with, it's going to show differently, and sometimes yellow is going to come up stronger than white or black. There are also precision chalks like these that have a little wheel with metal teeth, and when you are able to move that wheel along something, chalk comes out. Precision chalks are just filled with loose chalk powder so that whenever you are moving the wheel with metal teeth, chalk comes out and makes a line. These are great because they can make more precise lines than the classic chalk I was showing you earlier. Sometimes, especially when you use it often, they can become dull and you'll need to kind of sharpen the edges to make a precise line the same way that these will always consistently give you. The only thing with these that I've experienced sometimes is because it is loose powder, it can can not always come off as strong, especially if you're not working with a really dark fabric where there's really high contrast. This is a classic dressmaker's pencil. It comes with this to erase it using Frixion. I honestly don't use this one as often. It is convenient to have as a backup, but I rarely use it just because I don't really enjoy it. But everyone has a preference, so this is, I think, one of the cheaper options. Not that chalk is that expensive, but if you would like to try it, you should. This is my favorite one to mark with just because it is magic. However, it does come with a risk. These are Pilot Frixion colors, but these are markers that are friction and heat erasable. So what's really cool is that when you mark this on a fabric and you iron it, it literally disappears after you iron it. Like, it'll be black marker ink on the fabric, and after you iron it, gone. Even though it's really cool and is really effective in what it's intended to be used for, if you are ironing in between steps and you just marked something, guess what? Whatever you just marked, after you iron it, it's gone. And especially if you don't know what you just marked, again, it's gone forever. Use it at your own risk. The next thing you're going to need is a straight ruler. This is the ruler that I recommend. It's from Westcott. It's 18 inches long. It's clear and it's bendable. When you're working with curves, you can literally walk the ruler along the line. I love that these have the grids throughout the width of the ruler because I have other clear rulers where they kind of just stop and they have the metric system on the other side, I think is what it is. I don't use the metric systems. And on top of the 1/8 of an inch grid, they also have markings for 1/16 of an inch. So it really provides precision, which is something that I really value. I lost my other case of bobbins, so we're starting off really fresh, as you can see. But having a case for your bobbins is really great because it just keeps you organized, and you're going to be using a decent amount of bobbins depending on how many colors you're working with, because you're going to need a different bobbin for every color, unless you're willing to unwind a bobbin every time you're switching colors if you're only working with one bobbin. But that's really unrealistic, so I highly suggest that you go out and invest in a set of bobbins with a bobbin case so that you can stay organized. The next thing you're going to need is a magnetic pin cushion. You technically can get a traditional pin cushion, and I do use it sometimes, as you can see, but for the most part, I only use this for my hand sewing needles because it is great to have it separately while I am hand sewing and just place it so I don't lose where my needle is, because I have lost so many hand sewing needles before. But these are better while I'm sewing just because it's so much easier for me to kind of throw my pins and have it land where it needs to land. It's also really convenient to use your magnetic pin cushion to clean up pins that you've dropped. That's why I like to use a magnetic pin cushion over a traditional pin cushion. The next thing you're going to need are snips, and these are just more convenient to be cutting off all of your threads than using your scissors every single time. There's different designs for snips. There's these types where you just squeeze and cut. I used to have some that were like mini scissors, but they were also inconvenient and they also got stolen. So here we are with these thread snips that I actually enjoy a lot better. You're also going to need a flat-headed screwdriver. You're going to need these whenever you're changing out your needles on your sewing machine, as well as certain presser feet. I have seen some people use a coin, but especially when you're changing out your needles, depending on your machine, the coin is going to typically be too thick. They come in a lot of different sewing kits that you can buy, so I would highly recommend getting one with a screwdriver because for me at least, it's a necessity. The last thing you're going to need is pattern drafting paper. You do not necessarily need to buy a roll the way that I have it in. You can definitely work with what you have at home. You can literally take different pieces of printer paper and tape them together and use that as pattern paper, especially when you're just starting out. And that concludes the list of all the materials you need in order to get started with hand and machine sewing. Thank you so much for watching this far. My name is Michelle. I have a degree in fashion design, and I am making these videos to teach my brother how to sew. So Marco, you better be watching. Even though there are a lot of videos out there to teach people how to sew, my brother was telling me how he was having a difficult time with finding ones that were for very, very beginners without any prior knowledge whatsoever. He was finding a lot of them hard to follow just because they were using really advanced terminology that he wasn't familiar with. He got caught up in watching a chain of tutorials to explain the other tutorial that he just watched because he didn't understand this part, but then he also didn't understand the new one that he was watching. So here I am creating We the Future of Sewing to help every single beginner, no matter what level you are, to learn how to sew. It doesn't matter if you have never seen a sewing needle before, if you've never turned on a sewing machine before, I'm going to walk you through every single step and explain everything along the way. My next video is going to go over everything you need to know to understand and set up a sewing machine. Like I said, we're really taking things slow so that everyone can really get a good understanding and foundation before we start getting into the actual sewing. So please, 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 if you have any questions, please do not be shy to ask them. I totally understand what it's like to learn something new. It can be intimidating, it can be stressful, and I am here to provide the support that you need so that you can feel passionate and excited about learning a new skill, because sewing is a very valuable and rewarding skill to have. It's great to be able to sew something entirely on your own and be able to use it, wear it, or to be able to fix garments. It is a great life skill that cannot be understated. I look at every single comment that I get, and I will be able to address your comment either in the comment section or in a new video. So if you're like my brother and you are a capital B beginner sewist, subscribe to We the Future of Sewing, and I am here to help you along every single step of the way, because I know that sewing can be scary and frustrating, and I'm here to provide the support that you need. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.